It came low across the prairie, pressing against the barn boards with a hollow whistle that sounded almost human. Folks who had lived out on that stretch of land long enough could tell the difference between a passing winter gust and something that meant to stay. This one meant to stay. The sky had gone the color of cold iron by late afternoon, and the air carried that sharp stillness that makes a person pull their coat tighter without knowing why. She stood at the wide barn door and watched the horizon disappear. Most people in town thought she was stubborn. Some said proud, a few said foolish. They whispered that a woman her age ought to move in with relatives or sell the farm before it sold her. The winters had grown harder in recent years, and the old farmhouse creaked in places that worried even the wind. But she had not stayed all these years by accident. The barn behind her was older than the highway that cut through the county. Its boards were gray and split, patched, and nailed so many times that no single plank looked the same. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired back. From the outside, it was just another worn-down building on the prairie, leaning into time. Inside, it smelled of hay, dust, and the faint sweetness of old wood warmed by memory. And hidden deep within it was the one thing no one in town knew about. She had built it herself, piece by piece, with hands that once stitched quilts and carried water buckets. It had not started as a plan anyone would call sensible. It started as a thought she could not shake after the second winter alone, when the farmhouse furnace failed and the pipes froze solid. She had sat at the kitchen table that night in her coat and gloves, watching her breath cloud in front of her face, and made a quiet promise that she would not spend another winter at the mercy of a broken heater. The idea came from an old magazine left behind at the feed store. An article about a Quonset hut, the curved steel kind soldiers once used during the war. The article spoke of their strength, their simple design, their way of holding heat when insulated right. Most folks thought of them as temporary buildings, practical and plain. She saw something else. She saw shelter. She saw control. The barn was large enough to hide it. That was the part that made her smile to herself whenever she thought about it. The town would never understand. They would laugh at the thought of a Quonset hut tucked inside an old wooden barn like a secret inside a secret. But she knew something about storms that most people forgot. Wind could tear at flat walls and slip through cracks and square corners, but it slid over curves. It had nothing to grab. The first time she ordered the steel panels, the delivery driver asked too many questions. She told him she was fixing a shed out back. He nodded and left without much fuss. Over the course of one long summer, she worked when no one was watching. She measured twice, cut once, and bolted each curved rib into place on a concrete pad she poured with the help of a neighbor who believed he was laying a floor for storage. Inside the barn, the Quonset hut rose like a silver half-moon, hidden by shadow and old beams. From the outside, nothing changed. The barn doors stayed crooked. The paint stayed chipped. But inside, behind stacked bales of hay and a row of wooden crates, a rounded steel shell began to take shape. She insulated it thick. Not just enough to get by, but enough to hold warmth the way a thermos holds coffee. She lined the inside with simple plywood, built narrow shelves along the walls, and fitted a small cast-iron stove near the back. She hauled in blankets, stored canned goods, and stacked water jugs under a bench she built with her own hands. By the time autumn came that year, the hidden hut was ready. She did not move into it right away. Pride is a strange thing. She continued sleeping in the farmhouse through mild weather, tending her small garden and feeding the chickens as always. But when the weather report spoke of deep freezes and heavy snow, she began carrying small loads into the barn. A quilt here. A lantern there. No one noticed. The first winter she tested it was quiet. Snow fell, wind blew, and the old farmhouse rattled in its usual way. On the coldest nights, she walked across the yard under a moon that lit the drifts like rolling waves and slipped inside the barn. She closed the heavy doors behind her and stepped into the curved shelter hidden within. The difference was immediate. The hut held warmth close. The stove's heat did not wander off into corners and high ceilings the way it did in the farmhouse. The rounded walls gathered it, kept it, returned it. She would sit on the narrow cot she built along one side, listening to the wind slam against the barn, and feel a calm she had not felt in years. But she told no one. People in town saw what they expected to see: a woman alone on a worn farm, a sagging house with smoke rising from its chimney. They did not see the second chimney tucked low inside the barn roof, its thin trail of smoke blending with the first. They did not know she had built herself a steel heart inside a wooden shell. Now, as the wind pressed harder and the sky darkened, she felt that old promise stir again. The radio had said the word blizzard with a seriousness that made even the weatherman pause. Not just snow, not just wind. A full whiteout with temperatures dropping fast and staying low for days. The kind of storm that stranded cars and buried fences. The kind that found every weakness in a house and widened it. She stepped into the farmhouse one last time before night fell and ran her hand along the kitchen table. The wood was scarred with years of use. She had raised children here. She had waited for letters at this very spot. The house held her history, but it did not hold heat the way it once did. When the first flakes began to fall, she carried her final load across the yard. The snow was light at first, drifting sideways like curious dust. By the time she reached the barn, it had thickened, clinging to her coat and hair. She pushed the barn door shut behind her, dropped the wooden bar into place, and stood in the dim light filtering through cracks in the boards. The barn groaned as the wind rose. She moved past the old plow, past the stack of crates, and pulled aside the hanging tarp that hid the curved steel doorway. The Quonset hut waited, quiet and steady. She opened its door and stepped inside. The air felt different at once. Warmer already from the small fire she had started earlier in the day. The stove glowed faintly, and the insulated walls seemed to hush the outside world. She closed the hut door behind her and slid the latch. Outside, the storm found its voice. Snow began to hit the barn in thick waves, driven hard by wind that howled through every gap in the boards. The rafters creaked, dust shook loose from the beams. The sound was fierce, almost angry. She sat on the cot and listened, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot tea. For a while, she wondered if she had been foolish after all. The barn was old, strong in its time, but old. She imagined the wind lifting at its roof, prying at its sides. She imagined snow piling against its walls until the weight grew too heavy. If the barn gave way, would the steel shell inside hold? Would it matter if the outer walls fell, or would they shield her long enough? The temperature dropped sharply by midnight. She could feel it even inside the hut, a deep cold pressing against the insulated walls. The stove worked steady, its heat spreading in a gentle circle around her. She fed it small pieces of wood, careful not to waste fuel. The curved ceiling reflected warmth downward, wrapping around her shoulders like a hand. Then came a sound that made her freeze. A crack, not sharp, but heavy, followed by the long groan of timber under strain. She set her mug down and stood. The hut felt solid beneath her feet, but the barn beyond it shuddered again. Snow and ice scraped along the roof in thick sheets. Another crack split the air, louder this time. She pictured the barn doors tearing loose. She pictured the wind pouring in, snow filling the space between the wooden walls and her steel shelter. If the barn collapsed, debris could crash against the hut. The weight might block her exit. The wind roared as if answering her fear. She moved to the small round window she had cut into the hut door and peered out. Through the narrow view she could see only darkness and the faint shape of hay bales shifting as gusts forced their way through the barn seams. A loose board slammed somewhere overhead. The crack came again, unmistakable now. Something large had given way. The barn trembled, and for a moment the sound of the storm grew even louder, as if a barrier had fallen. Snow swirled into the barn's interior, visible in thin white streaks through the hut's small window. The temperature in the outer space must have dropped instantly. Inside the Quonset hut, though, the air remained steady. Warm, close. She backed away from the door and stood very still, listening to the battle between wood and wind. The steel ribs around her did not shake. The curved walls did not rattle. The stove burned on, faithful and calm. Another heavy crash shook the barn, closer this time. She swallowed hard and looked around at the shelter she had built in secret, at the blankets folded neat, at the shelves lined with jars, at the stove that glowed like a small sun. The blizzard had come to test every promise she had made to herself. and as the barn gave another long, splintering groan in the dark, she realized she was about to find out whether hiding a Quonset hut inside it had been wisdom or the worst gamble of her life. The barn groaned again, long and low, like an animal too tired to keep standing. She did not move right away. She had learned over the years that panic wastes heat and strength. Instead, she stood in the center of the Quonset hut, one hand resting on the edge of the small wooden table she had built, and listened carefully. The wind pushed hard against the outer walls. Snow hissed and scraped across wood. Something heavy slid down the roof and struck the ground outside with a dull thud. The steel ribs above her did not shake. That steadiness brought back the memory of the day she first saw a Quonset hut up close. It had been years ago, on a long drive west to visit a cousin. Along the roadside sat an old army surplus lot, and behind it stood one of those curved metal buildings, faded and plain. She had pulled over out of curiosity. The owner, a broad man with oil-stained hands, told her those huts were built fast during the war. They were meant to be simple, strong, and able to stand up to weather in places far worse than her little stretch of prairie. He had knocked on the side of it with his knuckles. "Solid," he said. "Wind slides right off." She remembered pressing her palm against the cool metal that day and thinking how strange it felt. Not warm like wood, not welcoming at first touch, but certain, like something that would not bend just because the season changed. That word had stayed with her, certain. Back in the present, another sharp crack tore through the barn. This time, dust fell from somewhere above and drifted through the air, visible in the thin beam of light from her lantern. She stepped toward the hut door again and leaned close to the small window. Snow was now blowing inside the barn freely, carried in swirling sheets. The outer barn door must have given way, or part of the wall had split open. She could hear it clearly now. The wind was no longer muffled. It rushed through the barn with a hollow roar, turning loose boards into clapping hands. She drew back and shut her eyes for a moment. The barn had been her husband's pride. He had rebuilt half of it himself after a storm 20 years earlier. She could still see him on a ladder, hammer tucked into his belt, squinting at the roofline as if daring it to sag again. He had believed in wood and nails and hard work. Steel had not interested him much. He used to say metal sweats in summer and freezes in winter. He trusted timber because he understood it. When he passed, the barn became too large for one pair of hands to maintain. She patched what she could. She braced beams. She replaced a few boards each year. But time moves in quiet ways, and so does rot. By the time she began building the hidden Quonset hut inside it, she already knew the barn would not last forever. That was part of the plan. If the barn fell one day, it would fall around something stronger. The wind gave another violent shove, and the barn answered with a loud shudder that traveled through the ground and into the solace of her boots. She reached for the stove and fed it another split log, careful to close the iron door tight afterward. The small stove pipe ran upward and out through a narrow opening she had cut in the barn roof, sealed carefully around the edges. She had worried about that cut for weeks, afraid someone might notice. But from the outside, it looked like just another patched repair. Now she wondered if that opening had weakened the roof more than she meant it to. Snow battered the structure without mercy. The blizzard was no longer building. It had fully arrived. The temperature would be dropping fast outside, sinking well below zero. Out there, exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The wind would carve drifts tall enough to swallow fences and tractors. Inside the Quonset hut, the air remained almost gentle. The insulation held firm. The curved ceiling seemed to collect the stove's warmth and fold it back down around her. She could hear the storm, but it felt distant, like a story told from another room. Still, the barn around her was failing piece by piece. She sat down again, but she did not relax. Her mind drifted backward to the second winter after she was left alone on the farm. That winter had been the worst she had ever known. The farmhouse furnace had quit during a cold snap that lasted 10 straight days. The repairman could not make it through the snow. She had burned through most of her firewood trying to keep pipes from freezing, sleeping in her coat, waking every hour to check the stove. The pipes burst anyway. She had stood in ankle-deep water one morning, watching it freeze along the kitchen floorboards. That was the moment something shifted inside her. not anger, not quite fear. Something steadier, a quiet refusal to be caught helpless again. The Quonset hut had grown from that refusal. She remembered hauling each steel panel into place. The weight of them had surprised her, not impossible, but demanding. She had worked slowly, often stopping to catch her breath and look toward the road to be sure no one was watching. Pride played its part, yes, but there was something else. She did not want advice. She did not want to hear why it would not work. She wanted the proof to speak for itself one day. Another loud crash split the air, followed by a rush of wind so strong it made the hut door tremble in its frame. She stiffened. That was close, too close. Something heavy had fallen against the side of the Quonset hut, or perhaps against the barn wall just inches away from it. Snow now blew past the small round window in thick white streaks. The barn interior must be filling fast. If the outer walls had broken open, the drifts would pile high against the steel shell. She tried to picture the layout in her mind. The hut sat near the center of the barn floor, leaving space on all sides. If snow filled that space, it might actually insulate her further. But if the barn roof collapsed inward, beams could crash down and trap her inside. She walked slowly around the interior, touching the curved walls as if checking a living thing. The steel felt solid and faintly warm from the trapped heat within. The bolts held tight. The seams she had sealed with care did not leak. Outside, the barn groaned again, deeper this time, like a tired back bending too far. She thought about the town then, about the grocery clerk who always asked if she planned to sell, about the pastor who had once suggested she might find comfort living closer to neighbors. They meant well, but they did not understand what it meant to belong to a piece of land the way roots belong to soil. Leaving would have been easier. Staying required something else. The blizzard raged on, hour after hour. The sound became a constant wall of noise, wind, scraping wood, the steady pop of the stove. At some point she realized she could no longer hear the loose barn door banging. Either it had torn free completely or the snow had packed it tight. The temperature inside the hut remained steady, but she could sense the outside cold pressing harder. The stove demanded more fuel now to keep the same warmth. She rationed her wood carefully. She had stacked enough for days, but she had not expected the barn to take such a beating so quickly. Then came a new sound. A low grinding scrape, followed by the unmistakable snap of timber splitting in two. The entire barn shifted. The floor beneath her boots vibrated, and for a brief second the lantern flame flickered as if the air itself had moved. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. Dust rained down outside the hut. Something heavy struck the curved steel with a metallic clang, loud enough to echo inside the small space. Her heart pounded in her ears. That had been part of the roof. She knew the sound of falling beams. She had helped clear them once before after a summer storm. The barn roof was giving up, section by section. The weight of the snow, combined with the force of the wind, was more than old nails and tired wood could bear. She stood very still, waiting for the next blow. If the roof collapsed entirely, it might crush the hut under debris, or it might fall around it, leaving the steel arch standing like a shell in a sea of broken boards. She had calculated this possibility when she first built it. The curved design could deflect falling weight better than flat surfaces. That was the theory. Theory now faced a blizzard. Another beam cracked. This time it sounded farther back, near the old hayloft. The barn groaned long and loud, then fell into a strange half-silence. The wind still roared, but the structure's answering complaints seemed fewer. Either the weakest parts had already fallen, or the rest were bracing for one final surrender. She looked at the hut door. If the barn buried her in snow and timber, would she be able to dig her way out? The hut door opened outward into the barn. If debris blocked it, she might be sealed inside. She had considered that once before and added a small emergency hatch at the rear of the hut, one that led into a narrow gap between the steel shell and the barn wall. But if that space was filled with snow or crushed by falling boards, even that path might close. The wind howled again, shaking everything that still stood. She walked to the back of the hut and placed her hand on the emergency hatch. The metal latch felt cold, but firm. She had built this place to outlast a storm. She had believed in its strength. Now she needed it to prove her right. Another violent crash thundered overhead, louder than any before. The hut shuddered under a heavy impact, and for a split second the lantern swung from its hook. Then came the sound she had feared most. A deep, rolling collapse, as if a giant hand had pressed down on the barn roof and pushed. The world outside the Quonset hut seemed to fall in on itself. She braced her feet, heart pounding, as debris struck the curved steel above her with a series of heavy blows. Snow poured down in thick waves against the outer shell. The sound was overwhelming, wood snapping, nails screeching. Wind rushing through a space suddenly wider than before. And then, just as suddenly, the structure around her shifted into a new stillness. Not quiet, never quiet in a blizzard, but different. The barn was no longer fighting. She stood in the warm center of her hidden shelter, surrounded by steel and firelight, listening to the storm rage in what might now be open air. She did not know how much of the barn remained standing. She did not know whether the Quonset hut was buried in snow or standing exposed beneath a torn sky. All she knew was that the test had truly begun, and whatever lay outside that curved wall was no longer the same farm she had walked across at sunset. For a long moment she did not trust the quiet. The wind still roared, but the barn no longer answered it. There were no more groans of timber, no more desperate creaks. Whatever could fall had likely fallen. The Quonset hut stood in the middle of it all, the curved steel shell now bearing the weight of whatever lay above. She held her breath and waited for another impact. It did not come. Instead, there was a new sound. Snow, steady and heavy, sliding down metal. It moved across the rounded roof of the hut in thick waves, spilling down both sides. The curved design was doing what she had hoped it would. The weight was not settling. It was shedding. Still, the pressure above felt real. She could sense it in the way the air inside seemed tighter, the way every small noise echoed sharper. If the barn roof had collapsed entirely, broken beams and planks might be resting across the steel arch. If enough snow gathered on top of that, the combined weight could test even strong ribs and bolts. She stepped closer to the stove and checked the fire. It burned steady, a small, bright center in the dim room. She had built the Quonset hut for insulation and warmth, but she had also built it for something harder to name. Control, perhaps. A place where wind and winter could not bully her. But no structure, no matter how strong, could quiet the thoughts that rise in the middle of the night. She thought about the road leading to her farm. By now, it would be gone under drifting snow. The county plow would not come until the storm passed, and even then it might take days. Power lines could already be down. The radio had gone silent an hour earlier, the signal swallowed by the storm. If something went wrong inside this steel shelter, no one would know. That was the true weight pressing on her now. She moved to the small shelf where she kept her supplies and checked them again, though she had counted them twice already. Canned beans, corn, dried meat. 2 loaves of bread wrapped tight, water jugs lined along the wall. A small battery lantern, extra matches sealed in a jar. She had prepared for days of isolation. But preparation is not the same as certainty. The hut creaked softly as wind pushed against debris piled on top. A board scraped across the metal with a long, dragging sound that made her shoulders tense. She imagined the barn's remains scattered around her, half buried in snow. The outer walls might be gone entirely. The hayloft could be crushed flat. The old wooden beams her husband had lifted into place years ago might now lie snapped and useless. A strange grief rose in her chest at the thought. The barn had been more than lumber. It held years of work. It had sheltered livestock through harsh winters, stored harvests, kept tools dry. It had stood as proof that their labor meant something. Now it might be reduced to splinters. She had known this day could come. Still, knowing does not soften the blow. Another gust hit, and the hut shuddered slightly under shifting weight. Snow cascaded down the curved sides again, thumping softly against what must now be deep drifts at the base. The design was holding. The steel ribs were distributing the load just as she had hoped. She let out a slow breath. Then she heard it. A faint, distant sound beneath the wind. At first she thought it was just loose metal vibrating, but it came again, a muffled thump. Then another. Not from above, but from somewhere beyond the steel wall. She froze. It was not the sound of collapsing wood. It had a rhythm to it, slow, uneven. She stepped toward the hut door and pressed her ear against the cool metal. The wind howled outside, but beneath it she heard something else. A scraping, a dull bump, then silence, then another bump. Her mind raced. It could be debris shifting in the storm, a board knocked loose and carried against the hut, or it could be something heavier rolling in the wind. But the sound felt different, less wild, more deliberate. She imagined a fallen beam leaning against the hut, rocking in gusts. That would explain the rhythm. But the bumps were not high enough to strike the roof. They seemed closer to ground level. The farm had no livestock left. The chickens were secured in a coop near the farmhouse, though she worried now whether that small structure had survived. Coyotes sometimes roamed the fields in winter, but no animal would move much in a blizzard like this, unless it was desperate. The thump came again, slightly louder. She felt a flicker of fear that had nothing to do with collapsing roofs. Being alone is one thing. Being alone with an unknown presence just outside your shelter is another. She forced herself to think clearly. The Quonset hut was sealed tight, the steel door latched firm. Even if something pushed against it, the frame was reinforced. She had tested it more than once. Still, she reached for the heavy iron poker by the stove and held it close. The sound stopped, only wind now. Only the endless rush of snow against metal and broken wood. She stood there a long time, listening. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the last conversation she had with the banker in town. He had driven out one spring afternoon, hat pulled low, papers tucked under his arm. The farm's taxes had risen, maintenance costs too. He had spoken gently, suggesting that perhaps selling the property might bring peace of mind. Peace of mind. She almost laughed now at the memory. There was no peace in selling the place that held your life. There was only a different kind of storm. The hidden Quonset hut had been her answer to more than winter. It had been her answer to doubt, to whispers, to the idea that she was too old or too alone to manage. But tonight, buried under snow and broken timber, the answer felt fragile. The wind shifted direction suddenly, striking from the opposite side. The hut trembled as debris scraped and slid across the curved roof. Something heavy rolled down and hit the ground with a deep thud. The steel held. She imagined the scene outside. The barn walls likely blown outward, roof caved in, boards scattered in drifts. The Quonset hut might now stand exposed in the center of a ruin, half buried in white. Or perhaps it was completely entombed, a steel bubble under a frozen sea. If snow piled high enough against the door, opening it later could be impossible. The realization settled hard in her chest. Warmth meant nothing if she could not eventually get out. She moved to the rear emergency hatch again and examined the bolts with trembling fingers. The narrow gap between the hut and the old barn wall might now be crushed shut. If so, both exits could be sealed by snow and debris. She pictured digging upward through a hatch into packed snow, gasping for air, clawing toward a sky she could not see. The image tightened her throat. Another faint sound came from outside. Not a thump this time. A scrape, then what sounded almost like a low cry, carried thinly between gusts. Her heart jumped. It was not the wind. Wind has a constant voice. This was brief, broken, almost human. She held still, barely breathing. Again, faint and far, a sound rose and vanished. Someone out there? The thought struck her like a physical blow. The highway was miles away, but travelers sometimes tried to cut across county roads to save time. If a car had slid off and someone attempted to walk for help, they could easily lose direction in a whiteout. The farm buildings would have been nearly invisible in this storm. If someone had stumbled near the barn before it collapsed, they might now be trapped in the snow outside. She felt a surge of urgency that clashed sharply with her fear. Opening the hut door now could be dangerous. Snow might rush in. Wind could snatch warmth in seconds. If debris blocked the way, she could be pinned or lost in the white. But if someone was out there, freezing in the blizzard, every minute mattered. The cry came again, faint but unmistakable this time. She did not hesitate. She set the poker down and moved to the door latch. Her hands shook, though she told herself it was only the cold pressing through the steel. She paused, listening one last time. Wind roared, then silence. Then a weak, distant call swallowed by the storm. She lifted the latch. For a second, she stood there, feeling the weight of the decision. The Quonset hut had been built to keep her safe, warm, insulated from winter's cruelty. Stepping outside meant surrendering that safety to whatever chaos waited beyond. But she had not built this shelter to become smaller inside it. She pulled the door inward just a fraction. Snow pressed hard against it. A rush of icy air forced its way through the gap, stinging her face. She pushed harder, bracing her shoulder against the steel. The door gave slowly, scraping against packed snow. White filled her vision. The barn was gone. Where wooden walls had once stood, there was only open night and swirling snow. Broken beams lay scattered like fallen matchsticks, half buried. The roof had collapsed entirely, its pieces resting in drifts around the curved steel shell of the Quonset hut. And somewhere beyond that wreckage, in the roaring dark, something moved. She squinted through the blowing snow, heart hammering. A shape struggled against the wind, barely visible through the white. Not far, too far to ignore. She tightened her coat around her shoulders and stepped one boot into the snow, the storm instantly clawing at her clothes and skin. Behind her, the warm glow of the hidden hut flickered in the doorway, small and fragile against the vast fury of the blizzard. Ahead of her, the shadow stumbled and fell. The wind hit her like a wall. It stole her breath in one sharp pull and filled her mouth with snow. She grabbed the edge of the Quonset hut door with one hand to steady herself and forced her eyes open against the white blur. The barn was nothing but wreckage now. Broken beams leaned at odd angles. Sheets of old tin roofing were half buried in drifts. Snow swirled through everything, erasing edges, turning the world into moving white. The shape ahead struggled again. It was not far, 20 steps, maybe less. But in a blizzard, 20 steps can feel like a mile. The figure tried to stand and fell sideways into a drift that swallowed it up to the shoulders. She stepped forward. The snow reached past her knees at once, thick and heavy from blowing and packing in layers. Each step took effort. The wind pushed her sideways, trying to turn her around. She kept one arm out in front of her, feeling through the white, keeping her eyes locked on that dark shape. She could not leave someone out there. The thought was not loud. It was simple and steady. The same steady thought that had led her to build a hidden Quonset hut inside an old barn when others would have shaken their heads. You prepare, you endure. And when someone else needs help, you step into the storm. The figure moved again, weak and slow. She pushed harder, lifting her boots high to break through the drifted snow. Ice formed instantly along the edge of her scarf where her breath froze. The cold bit at her cheeks and nose, sharp and merciless. She could feel it creeping through her coat already. Halfway there, she stumbled over a buried plank from the collapsed barn roof. She caught herself on her hands, snow filling her gloves. The wind roared louder as if pleased to see her falter. She rose again. The figure was clearer now. A person, wrapped in a dark coat, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something unseen. Their head was bowed, snow clinging thick to hair and shoulders. They tried once more to rise, then slumped. Fear tightened her chest. She reached them and dropped to her knees in the snow. The wind ripped at her back. She brushed snow away from the person's face. A young face, pale and stunned, eyes barely open against the storm. "You have to get up," she shouted, though her voice was nearly stolen by the wind. The person blinked slowly, confusion clouding their expression. Their lips moved, but the words were lost. Their hands were bare. That alone sent a jolt of urgency through her. Bare hands in this cold would not last long. She grabbed both of their arms and pulled. The snow resisted like wet cement. The young person tried weakly to help, boots slipping under them. "Lean on me," she called again. Step by step, they moved. The Quonset hut's curved steel shape loomed through the white like a dull silver moon half buried in snow. Without the barn walls, it stood exposed, drifts already building high along its sides. Broken timber lay scattered around it, some pieces lodged against the curved roof, others half swallowed by snow. The hut looked smaller now, alone in the open. They reached the doorway. Snow had already piled high against the entrance she had forced open minutes earlier. She shoved at it with her shoulder, widening the gap. The warm air inside spilled out and vanished instantly in the wind. With one last pull, she guided the young stranger through the door and inside the hidden shelter. She pushed hard and forced the steel door shut against the snowpack, sealing them back into warmth. The silence inside felt almost unreal after the storm's roar. The stranger collapsed onto the wooden floor just inside the door, shaking violently. Snow melted fast against the warm air, soaking into clothes and pooling on the planks. She moved quickly. The stove glowed strong, and she fed it another log without hesitation. This was no time to ration. She grabbed a thick wool blanket from the shelf and wrapped it tightly around the young person's shoulders. Their hands were red and stiff, skin pale in patches. "You need to warm slowly," she said, more to steady herself than to instruct. "You are safe now." The stranger's eyes flickered around the inside of the Quonset hut. Confusion shifted into something like disbelief. The curved insulated walls, the shelves of supplies, the small stove casting its orange light. It must have felt like stepping into a hidden world beneath the storm. "My car," the young person whispered at last, voice hoarse. "Road disappeared." "I tried to walk," she nodded. That was all the explanation needed. "You are not walking anywhere else tonight." Outside, the blizzard howled against the steel shell. Snow slid down the curved roof in heavy waves. Debris scraped across the metal now, and then as wind shifted the wreckage of the barn. She helped peel off the soaked coat and boots, setting them near the stove but not too close. She handed over dry wool socks from her own small stack and a second blanket. The stranger's teeth chattered uncontrollably. "What is this place?" they managed to ask. She glanced around at the curved ceiling, the simple wooden shelves, the stove that had become their center. "It is what kept me warm," she replied. The young person gave a faint, shaky laugh that turned into a cough. It worked. She felt something loosen in her chest at that. Yes, it worked. But the storm had not finished. A heavy thud struck the roof, harder than any before. The hut shuddered under the impact. Both of them looked up at once. The barn debris was still shifting outside. The wind had likely caught part of the collapsed roof and thrown it against the steel arch. The Quonset hut absorbed the blow, the curved ribs spreading the force. Snow slid again down the sides. The young stranger's eyes widened. "It is strong," she said firmly. "Stronger than it looks." She hoped that was true. The temperature inside began to rise again as the stove burned hotter. Steam lifted from their drying clothes. The stranger's shaking eased little by little. Color returned faintly to their cheeks. She poured a cup of warm water and pressed it into their hands. "Small sips," they obeyed without argument. For a moment, despite the storm and the ruin outside, the hut felt almost peaceful. 2 people breathing. Fire crackling, steel walls holding back the winter. Then a new sound reached them. Not from outside this time, from beneath. A low groan, deep and shifting, traveled through the floor. She stiffened. The Quonset hut rested on a concrete pad poured directly over the barn's packed earth floor. If the barn walls had collapsed outward, snow might now be piling unevenly around the base of the hut. If drifts grew too high on one side, the pressure could shift the structure slightly. The groan came again, faint but real. The young person looked at her, fear rising again. "It is just settling," she said, though she was not fully certain. The weight outside was changing by the minute. Wind could carve one side of a drift down and pile another high as a wall. If the hut tilted or shifted too far, the door could jam. The stovepipe could bend. Even strong steel has limits. She walked slowly around the interior, listening for changes. The curved walls looked unchanged, the bolts still tight. The seams still sealed, but she could feel something in the air. A subtle lean, perhaps. Or maybe it was only her imagination after the long night. Another heavy gust struck, and this time the entire hut vibrated more noticeably. Snow thumped hard against one side. The groan beneath the floor deepened briefly before fading. She returned to the stove and added another log. The fire flared, casting stronger light across the plywood walls. "You built this?" the young stranger said quietly, studying the structure with new understanding. "Yes, inside the barn. Yes, why?" She paused at that. Because winter does not care how old you are, she answered simply. And because sometimes you need to build your own shelter when the old one starts to fail? The stranger nodded slowly, absorbing the meaning behind the words. Outside, the blizzard shifted again. The wind screamed across open ground where barn walls once stood. Without those wooden barriers, the full force of the storm now struck the Quonset hut directly. The curved design deflected much of it, but the sound was fiercer, closer. Snow continued to pile against the lower half of the structure. She could imagine it now reaching higher along the steel sides, climbing toward the small round window in the door. If it covered that window entirely, they would be blind to the outside. If it covered the door, opening it later would require digging through packed ice. The groan beneath the floor came once more, longer this time. She looked at the emergency hatch at the rear wall. If snow buried the main door completely, that hatch might be their only path. But if the hut shifted further, even that narrow escape could become impossible. The young stranger followed her gaze. "We are not buried," she said firmly, more to reassure herself than them. "Not yet." The words hung in the warm air. The stove crackled. The steel walls held. Outside, the storm raged on without mercy. She stood in the center of the Quonset hut, between fire and steel, between shelter and ruin, feeling the weight of snow and wind press in from all sides. She had built this place for survival. Now it held two lives instead of one. Another violent gust slammed into the structure, stronger than any before. The hut lurched slightly, enough that a tin cup rattled off the shelf and rolled across the floor. Both of them froze. The groan beneath them rose into a low, steady strain. The blizzard was not finished testing her hidden shelter. And for the first time since she stepped back inside, she felt the edge of doubt return, sharp as the wind outside, whispering that even strong steel and careful planning can be pushed to their limits when winter decides to prove a point. The hut leaned again, just a fraction, but enough to make both of them feel it. She reached out and placed her palm against the curved steel wall as if steadying a living thing. The groan beneath the floor rose and then held, a deep strain that seemed to stretch through the concrete pad and into the frozen earth below. The young stranger's eyes were wide, fear rising fast. "It is the snow shifting," she said, her voice calm though her heart pounded. "The wind piles it up, then it slides." "That curve is pushing it off?" Another hard gust struck the Quonset hut, but this time the sound was different. Instead of a heavy impact, there was a long rushing slide. Snow cascaded down both sides in thick sheets. The pressure that had been building against one wall suddenly eased. The groan beneath their feet softened. They both listened carefully. Outside, the blizzard still roared, but the sharp jolts against the structure grew less violent. The steel ribs did what they had been designed to do decades ago in open fields and wartime camps. The wind could not grip them. The weight could not settle easily on a rounded roof. The hut steadied. She did not relax yet. She had learned that winter sometimes pretends to weaken before one last hard blow. She added another log to the cast-iron stove, keeping the fire strong. Warmth mattered now more than ever. Heat meant life. Heat meant time. The young stranger sat wrapped in blankets, color returning slowly to their face. Their shaking had stopped. Their breathing had steadied. The warmth inside the insulated Quonset hut felt almost unreal compared to the chaos outside. "Why did you build it inside the barn?" they asked softly after a long silence. She thought about that question. "The barn hid it," she said. "Steel draws attention, wood does not. And the barn blocked the wind from every side. It gave the hut another layer." She paused and glanced toward the door. "Even when the barn fell, it broke the worst of the storm first. It took the first hit." The young stranger looked around at the curved walls, at the shelves of canned food, at the careful bolts and seams. "You planned for this. I planned for winter," she replied. "Winter always comes." The storm raged on through the night, but the worst of its fury seemed to have passed. The gusts became more spaced apart. The heavy impacts stopped. Now the wind howled steady rather than violent, and the snow sliding down the steel roof came in softer waves. At some point, exhaustion settled into her bones. The long hours, the rescue in the blizzard, the strain of waiting for the structure to fail had taken their toll. She sat down near the stove, keeping one ear tuned to every sound. The young stranger dozed, wrapped tight in blankets, safe inside the hidden shelter. She let her mind wander back through the years, to the day she first bolted the steel ribs into place on the concrete pad, to the quiet pride she felt when the curved frame stood upright inside the old barn, to the evenings she worked alone with a wrench in hand, sealing seams, fitting insulation, building shelves. She remembered the doubts that crept in during those months, the thought that maybe she was foolish, that maybe the banker was right and she should let go, but something inside her had refused. She had not built the Quonset hut just for warmth. She had built it to prove that resilience is not loud. It does not need applause. It is steady work done when no one is watching. Near dawn, the wind began to ease. The difference was gradual at first. The roar softened into a long, steady sigh. The scraping of debris against steel stopped altogether. Snow no longer slammed into the walls, but drifted gently instead. She rose slowly and stepped toward the door. The young stranger stirred. "Is it over?" "Not fully," she said. "But it is changing." She unlatched the steel door carefully and pushed. It resisted at first. Snow had packed high against it. She leaned her shoulder into it and felt the drift give slightly. With steady pressure, she forced it open just enough to see. Morning light spilled in, pale and cold but calm. The sight outside made her catch her breath. The barn was gone, completely gone. Where once stood weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof, there was only a field of white, broken by scattered beams half buried in drifts. The roof had collapsed flat in places, its boards poking through the snow like ribs beneath skin. And in the center of it all stood the Quonset hut, curved steel arch rising from the snow like something planted there on purpose. Snow clung halfway up its sides, but the rounded roof was mostly clear, the wind having swept it clean. The hidden shelter was no longer hidden. It stood exposed under a wide winter sky, strong and intact. The young stranger moved beside her and stared in disbelief. It held. "Yes," she said quietly. It held. The air outside was still bitter cold, but the storm had moved on. The sky in the east showed a faint line of light where the sun would rise. The wind now was only a steady breeze, nothing like the violent blizzard of the night before. They stepped carefully out into the snow together. The drifts were deep, some reaching nearly to her waist in places. The wreckage of the barn lay scattered across the field, but most of it had fallen outward, just as she had hoped when she first imagined the worst case. The Quonset hut's curved design had allowed debris to slide off rather than crush it. She walked a slow circle around the structure, inspecting every seam and bolt. A few scratches marked the steel. One small dent near the roof where a beam had struck hard, but the ribs held firm. The foundation had not shifted more than a fraction. The young stranger looked toward the road, barely visible beyond the snow-covered field. "My car is out there somewhere. We will find it when the plow comes," she said. "For now, we stay warm." They returned inside to gather strength and wait. By midday, the distant rumble of heavy machinery reached them through the cold air. The county snowplow had begun its slow work along the main road. Word traveled fast in small towns. By afternoon, a neighbor arrived on a tractor fitted with chains, carving a path through the drifts toward the farm. His eyes widened when he saw the remains of the barn and the steel Quonset hut standing alone in the center. "I thought you were finished," he called out over the engine noise. She stepped forward, snow crunching under her boots. "I had a backup," she replied simply. He climbed down and walked around the curved structure, running his hand along the steel. "You built this?" "Yes." "Inside the barn?" "Yes." He shook his head slowly, but there was no laughter in it now, only respect. The young stranger was soon reunited with others from town, grateful and still wrapped in one of her wool blankets. Before leaving, they turned back to her. "You saved me." She looked at the steel arch rising behind her and then at the wide winter sky. "We saved each other," she said. "This shelter was built for one. It worked for two." In the weeks that followed, the story spread. Not as gossip, but as something closer to admiration. The woman who hid a Quonset hut inside her barn. The blizzard that proved it kept her warm. The rescue during the storm. The steel shelter that stood when wood could not. The banker came again, papers still tucked under his arm, but his tone had changed. "You have something special here," he admitted, glancing at the curved structure now clearly visible from the road. She nodded. I do. Instead of selling, she rebuilt. Not another traditional barn, but a simpler structure around the existing Quonset hut, leaving part of the steel arch visible as its core. This time she did not hide it. The curved roof became part of the design, a reminder that strength does not need to look like it always has. Neighbors offered help. Lumber arrived. Nails rang against wood once more. The farm did not shrink. It adapted. When the next winter came, she did not fear it the same way. The Quonset hut stood ready, insulated and warm, its cast iron stove polished and waiting. The memory of that blizzard stayed with her, but not as something dark. It became proof. Proof that preparation matters. That resilience can be built with your own hands. That old American grit is not about noise or pride, but about quiet work done before the storm arrives. On clear nights, when the wind moved gently across the prairie, she would step outside and look at the curved steel shining faint under the moonlight. The barn that once hid it was gone, but in its place stood something stronger, something earned. Winter would always come. Storms would always test what stands. But inside that Quonset hut, warmed by fire and memory,